connect your account. I'm going to connect my account. I'm going to choose this account, which is the one I'm really using. And here the chat, when you click start streaming, you need to fill this out. You need to add the description of your video. To add the description of this out. You need to add the description.
Exactly 02:17 hours on April 22nd, 2026, In the ink-black waters of the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point just 21 nautical miles wide, where a fifth of the world's oil once flowed like a liquid heartbeat, a sonar technician aboard an MH-60R Romeo Seahawk helicopter with call sign Triton 61 heard something that made his blood run cold. A frequency anomaly. A transient acoustic signal lasting exactly 1.4 seconds. The kind of sound that a trained ACQ-SYS operator recognizes immediately. The hydraulic hiss of a torpedo tube hatch opening, but not firing, loading, and then silence. Whatever was below them was not attacking. It was working, methodically, deliberately, planting something into the seafloor at the precise coordinates of the main shipping lane. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had just made the most audacious move of the entire conflict. Hidden beneath a swarm of 47 boghammer fast attack boats into the seafloor running surface harassment patterns against the USS Paul Ignatius DDG 117. Using the combined noise signature of nearly 600 outboard motors to acoustically blind American passive sonar arrays, an Iranian Kilo-class submarine, hull designated Iris Fateh, had maneuvered to a depth of 22 meters and begun deploying a belt of MDM-6 bottom-influence mines. Pressure activated, magnetic influence triggered, designed to detonate against the double-hulled keel of very large crude carriers at a depth where conventional minesweepers cannot reach. The Iranians had been planning this operation for 14 days. They called it Operation Simorgh, named after the mythical Persian firebird. The plan was simple. If the U.S. Navy's blockade was choking Iran, Iran would choke the entire world. At 02:19 hours, Triton 61's ALFS, the airborne low-frequency sonar, dropped its active pinger to 80 meters. The return pulse hit the hull of the Kilo at 22 meters and came back in 0.3 seconds. The contact was real, solid, 210 meters in length, and moving at 2.1 knots on a heading of 284 degrees. The exact bearing of the shipping lane centerline. The sonar operator, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Webb, immediately keyed his ICS. Triton 61 to Paul Ignatius actual. Subsurface contact, possible submarine, contact Romeo. Classifying. Simultaneously, every sensor on the Boghammer swarm lit up on the AN/SPY-1D radar array of the Paul Ignatius. 47 surface contacts, some closing at 48 knots, spread across a 12-mile arc. This was the trap. The fast boats were not there to attack. They were there to force the American destroyer to focus every EW asset, every weapon system, and every available combat brain on the surface threat, while the real weapon, 22 meters below the surface, completed its work in the dark. The commanding officer of the Paul Ignatius, Commander Rachel Vargas, had 3 seconds to make the most consequential tactical decision of her career. She had a confirmed submarine contact in a critical shipping lane. She had 47 armed IRGC fast boats closing her position. She had a ship of 283 crew members, and she was standing in the Strait of Hormuz in the middle of a war. She picked up the SSIXS handset and did 2 things simultaneously. First, she ordered her Combat Information Center to go to General Quarters. Second, she transmitted a priority flash to NavCent. Submarine contact Romeo. Active mine laying suspected. Request immediate subsurface support. The klaxon screamed through every compartment of the Paul Ignatius. In the Combat Information Center, every tactical display shifted to wartime configuration. On the Aegis console, the SPY-1D track file on Contact Romeo pulsed red. 280 nautical miles away, in the Combat Information Center of CVN-79 John F. Kennedy, the priority flash hit the battle group's warfare commander like a thunderbolt. Within 90 seconds, Admiral Thomas Crane had authorized the immediate launch of 2 EA-18G Growlers from VFA 134 and ordered the Virginia-class submarine USS Vermont SSN 792, already running submerged patrol at periscope depth 40 nautical miles to the south, to accelerate to maximum speed on a direct intercept course for Contact Romeo. Vermont acknowledged with a single encrypted ping. She was already moving. What the IRGC Command Center in Bandar Abbas did not know, could not know, was that the USS Vermont had been pre-positioned to that exact patrol box 48 hours earlier, based on NSA SIGINT intercepts flagging anomalous IRGC submarine communications. The Americans had not been caught off guard. They had been waiting. The EA-18G Growlers, call signs Havoc 1-1 and Havoc 1-2, left the Kennedy's waste catapults at 02:23 hours at full military power, climbing through 400 knots in the first 20 seconds. Their ALQ-218 tactical jamming receivers were already sweeping the electromagnetic spectrum across the Boghammer Formation. What the Growlers found was extraordinary. The fastboat swarm was not using standard IRGC tactical radio frequencies. They were operating on a distributed frequency hopping network running across 14 discrete bands, changing codes every 400 milliseconds. A system U.S. signals intelligence had never before seen deployed by the IRGC in an active engagement. Havoc 1-1's electronic warfare officer immediately tagged the signature and transmitted it back to the Kennedy's SSEE Increment F signals exploitation system. The assessment came back in under 60 seconds. The communications architecture matched a system assessed to have been transferred to Iran by a third-party state actor within the last 90 days. This was not improvised. This was state-sponsored. And whatever nation had handed Tehran this technology had just made themselves a party to the mining of the world's most critical waterway.
Probably be playing games and other people use your internet. So I wouldn't
At
use more than half.
02:26 hours, the Boghammer swarm made its first coordinated move. Not an attack, a maneuver. All 47 boats simultaneously turned 15 degrees to starboard and began a slow, deliberate encirclement of the Paul Ignatius at a range of 4,000 yards. They were not closing, they were herding, buying time. Every minute the Paul Ignatius spent managing the surface threat was another minute the kilo below had to complete its mine belt. By NavSense assessment, the Iris Fateh carried a payload capacity of 24 mines in its external keel mine belt. At a deployment speed of 2.1 knots, with one mine dropped every 90 seconds, the submarine had potentially been operational for 7 minutes before Triton 6-1's detection. That meant as many as 4 to 6 MDM-6 mines were already resting on the seafloor of the main shipping channel. 6 pressure-sensitive, magnetically triggered contact mines. 6 silent reasons the Strait of Hormuz could remain closed, not for weeks, but for months, possibly years. Commander Vargas made the call. She ordered the Paul Ignatius to reverse course at 20 knots, breaking the herding maneuver, and simultaneously authorized the launch of an Mk-54 lightweight torpedo from her port side triple tubes. Not a firing solution against the kilo, a warning shot. The Mk-54 ran hot, straight, and normal for 800 yards, then went active with its sonar pinger, broadcasting a deafening active pulse directly at the kilo's hull at close range. The message to the Iranian submarine commander was unmistakable. We know you are there. We know what you are doing. Stop. The kilo stopped moving. At 02:29 hours, contact Romeo went dead quiet. The Iris Fateh had shut down her propulsion, her systems, her noise. The Kilo-class submarine, designed in the Soviet era and upgraded with Iranian IRGC modifications, was reverting to her primary survival strategy: absolute silence. She was going to drift and wait. The Iranian commander, Captain Second Rank Davoud Kashani, believed he had one card left to play. The fast boats above would keep the Americans occupied long enough for the mines already deployed to do their work once global shipping resumed. He didn't need to escape. He just needed to survive until dawn. He had underestimated the USS Vermont. At 02:31 hours, 40 nautical miles south, Vermont went to 400 feet
and pushed her GES-9G reactor plant to 90% power.
8,000.
She was making better than 30 knots, a speed that no surface ship radar can detect, and no conventional towed array sonar can reliably track in the acoustic clutter of a war zone. Her BSY-2 combat system had already developed a preliminary firing solution for Contact Romeo, based solely on the data relayed from Triton 6-1. Vermont was not approaching as a warning. She was approaching as an executioner, holding a loaded trigger and waiting for the order that nobody wanted to give. At the same time, NavCent activated the one asset that nobody had briefed to the public. Embedded in the belly of a Navy P-8A Poseidon circling at 28,000 feet overhead was an AN/AES-1 airborne mine detection system, transmitting multispectral laser pulses into the shallow water column directly along the shipping lane center line. Within 6 minutes of activation, the Poseidon's sensors had confirmed 5 discrete bottom contact anomalies, each one measuring between 1.2 and 1.4 meters in length, perfectly round, perfectly spaced at 400-meter intervals along the main channel. 5 MDM-6 mines on the seafloor of the world's most critical oil shipping lane. A minefield that, if left in place, would close the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping for 6 months, regardless of any ceasefire, regardless of any diplomatic agreement, regardless of any deal negotiated in Washington or Islamabad or Geneva. The mines do not care about politics. They care about the magnetic signature of a fully laden supertanker passing 4 meters above them.
For privacy, if you want people to go and see it, make sure it's
at 02:37 hours, NavCent transmitted the most critical message of the night, not to the Paul Ignatius, not to Vermont, not to the Growlers, but to a 12-man Navy explosive ordnance disposal mobile unit team aboard 2 rigid inflatable boats holding station in the shadow of a rocky shoal 3 nautical miles west of the detection zone. Nav Ode Mob Unit 5, codenamed Sandbar Alpha, had been pre-positioned for exactly this contingency 48 hours earlier. The mission directive was 3 words: execute, recover, sanitize. What followed was 14 minutes of the most dangerous maritime EOD operation of the conflict. 2 RIBE teams running blacked out at 35 knots, navigating by GPS-referenced mine position data transmitted directly from the P-8A overhead. Each team responsible for deploying Mk-30 influence sweep gear and Mk-7 neutralizing charges. The Boghammer swarm was still holding its encirclement of the Paul Ignatius, now 6 nautical miles distant, with 0 visibility on the EOD teams operating in the shadow of the shallow ridge. The Iranian fastboat commanders did not know the trap had been reversed. They believed they were still dictating the tempo. On the surface, it looked like a standoff. Below the surface, the Americans were systematically dismantling Iran's most dangerous strategic card, 1 mine at a time. At 02:41 hours, Sandbar Alpha's lead diver, Senior Chief Petty Officer James Okafor, entered the water at a point 18 inches above a live MDM-6 mine and began the neutralization sequence using a lightweight neutralizer charge with a 4-minute time delay fuse. The mine was a Soviet-designed device, but with visible Iranian machining modifications, new triggering electronics, a secondary magnetic influence sensor, and an anti-handling circuit that, if the mine had been disturbed even slightly before the neutralizer was fully seated, would have detonated it immediately. Senior Chief Okafor had trained for this exact mine variant in a classified simulation at Explosive Ordnance Disposal School Eglin 9 months earlier. He moved with the calm precision of a surgeon performing open heart surgery in a blackout. The water temperature was 28 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 0. He was working entirely by touch and by the red-filtered beam of a dive light held in his teeth. At 02:44 hours, the first neutralizer detonated. a muffled, concussive thump that sent a column of white water 20 feet into the dark Hormuz night. Then the second at 90 seconds. Then the third, the fourth, and the fifth. 5 mines, 5 neutralizations. 5 fewer reasons the global economy would collapse when the sun rose over the Persian Gulf. 5 mines, simultaneously, 800 meters to the south. Reasons the global economy would collapse when the sun rose over the Persian Gulf. 599 jamming simultaneously across all 800 meters to the south. Reasons the global economy would collapse when the sun rose over the IRGC 99 jamming simultaneously impenetrable electronic bands of the Vanguard. In the span of 8 seconds, and 47 Iranian fast attack boats went tactically deaf and blind. Their encrypted radio nets dissolved into static. Their targeting data links flatlined. The carefully orchestrated swarm became 47 individual boats with no coordination, no communications, and no orders. At 02:51 hours, Commander Vargas received word from NavCent that all 5 mines had been neutralized. No orders. She immediately ordered her EW suite to broadcast a directional message from NavCent that all 5 mines had been neutralized. A signal that was not a threat, not a demand, but a single encrypted data burst that translated, once decoded by the IRIS-Fateh's signals officer, to the precise GPS coordinates of each neutralized mine position. The message to Captain Kashani was deliberate and devastating. We found them all. We removed them all. We know your boat. We know your position, and we chose not to sink you.
The IRIS-Fateh did not surface. She did not respond. She slowly, carefully, at 1.8 knots, began moving south toward deeper water. Every second of her withdrawal tracked by Vermont's BSY-2 system with the cold indifference of a predator that has already decided not to hunt today. The Boghammer swarm, their command net restored only partially by switching to backup UHF frequencies, read the situation and broke formation within 90 seconds, scattering back toward Iranian coastal waters at full speed, as if the invisible hand of American electronic dominance had simply switched them off. In the coming hours, NavCent's press release would confirm only that U.S. naval forces conducted maritime security operations in the Strait of Hormuz. No mention of mines, no mention of the Kilo, no mention of Senior Chief Okafor floating alone in black water 18 inches above a live pressure-triggered weapon. The Strait of Hormuz was quiet again, but the seafloor of the world's most critical shipping channel would carry the memory of that night for years. In the acoustic databases of every navy that matters, in the classified after-action reports that would shape mine warfare doctrine for the next decade, and in the nightmares of the tanker captains who would eventually sail above the coordinates where 5 Iranian mines had rested on the sand. The war for the Strait of Hormuz is not won with aircraft carriers or political ultimatums. It is won by the people nobody broadcasts on the news. The sonar operator who heard a 1.4-second whisper in black water, the EOD diver who went under alone and came back up, and the submarine commander who held her torpedoes and chose dominance over destruction. The IRGC lost 14 mines worth of strategic leverage tonight, but they have hundreds more. And somewhere in the shipyards of Bandar Abbas, the next Kilo is being loaded. The next swarm is being briefed. And the frequency hopping technology that appeared in the Strait tonight was not built in Iran. It was transferred by someone who wants this war to last. The question you need to ask yourself is not whether the US Navy can handle what Iran has deployed today. The question is whether it can handle what Iran is being equipped with for tomorrow. Comment your answer below, because that answer determines the future of every barrel of oil that keeps your civilization running.
At exactly 08:38 hours local time on April 22nd, 2026, the Arabian Sea ceased to be a body of water and became a loaded gun. The Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide corridor of dark, mine-laced water between Iran and the Sultanate of Oman, was already the most dangerous maritime transit lane on the planet. The United States Navy had been enforcing a full naval blockade of Iranian ports since April 13th. Iran had responded by closing the strait entirely, charging million-dollar tolls, and now, with the ceasefire fraying at the seams,
Tehran had just made a move that would force the most powerful naval force in human history to respond within minutes. Two container vessels, the MV Celestine Trader, a Marshall Islands-flagged bulk carrier with partial links to a US-owned logistics firm, and the MV Indus Atlas, a Cypriot-registered tanker bound for the port of Fujairah, were transiting the northern edge of the strait at 12 knots when their captains received the transmission that turned their blood cold. An IRGC Revolutionary Guard Navy patrol boat had broadcast on VHF Channel 16, the international distress and calling frequency. "Foreign vessels, you are operating in Iranian-controlled waters in violation of sovereign navigation protocols. Cut your engines. You will be boarded." Neither captain complied. That decision lasted exactly 90 seconds. What happened next was not a boarding action. It was a precision seizure operation that had been rehearsed for weeks. Two Iranian Sina-class fast attack craft, each displacing 275 tons and armed with C-802 anti-ship missiles, 40mm Bofors guns, and a complement of 30 IRGC naval commandos in full tactical gear, came screaming out of the shadow of Keshem Island at 38 knots, their bow wakes white and violent in the pre-dawn thermal haze. Simultaneously, an IRGC helicopter, identified by the USS Paul Ignatius as an Augusta Westland AW-139 derivative, emerged from low altitude, dropping two fast rope teams directly onto the forward deck of the MV Celestine Trader. The vessel's crew of 24, including 3 American maritime contractors, were brought to the bridge at gunpoint within 4 minutes. The MV Indus Atlas surrendered without resistance 11 minutes later, as a third patrol craft came alongside with its 40mm gun trained point-blank at the bridge windows. At 08:51 hours, U.S. 5th Fleet Command at Naval Support Activity Bahrain received a Priority 1 flash message. The Automated Identification System, or AIS, transponders on both vessels had gone dark. In the Combined Maritime Forces Operations Center, every screen simultaneously shifted to the last known grid coordinates of both ships. The duty officer, a Navy commander, picked up the STE secure telephone and spoke 4 words that set the entire Persian Gulf on fire. "Execute Razor Fence Alpha." The response was immediate, overwhelming, and already in motion before the commander finished his sentence. Because the USS Paul Ignatius, an Arleigh Burke-class Flight 3 guided missile destroyer operating just 18 nautical miles southwest of the seizure coordinates, had already gone to general quarters. The ship's AN/SPY-6V1 air and missile defense radar, the most capable radar suite afloat, had been tracking the IRGC helicopter since it lifted off from Bandar Abbas Naval Station 34 minutes earlier. The Ignatius's Aegis combat system had flagged the flight profile at 08:24, a full 14 minutes before the seizure began. The Combat Information Center already had a firing solution. They simply hadn't been authorized to use it yet. On the bridge, the commanding officer received the Razor Fence Alpha authentication within seconds of the flash message transmission. He ordered, "Ahead full, 33 knots." The Arleigh Burke's 4 gas turbine engines, producing a combined 105,000 shaft horsepower, drove the 9,200-ton warship through the Hormuz chop like a blade. Simultaneously, the ship's electronic warfare suite, the AN/SLQ-32 V6 shipboard electronic warfare system, began painting the electromagnetic spectrum with targeted jamming across the IRGC's primary UHF tactical communications band at 380 to 400 MHz, cutting off the fast attack boats from their onshore command structure at Bandar Abbas. The Iranian patrol boat commanders suddenly found their radios producing nothing but digital noise. At the same time, 22,000 feet above the strait, an EP-3E Ares 2 signals intelligence aircraft, operating under NavCent control, was tasked to record every radio transmission the IRGC made in the next 60 minutes. The electronic fingerprint of this operation would be evidence, and the US Navy was going to need every bite of it.
What Tehran did not know, what they could not know, was that the USS Paul Ignatius, was not operating alone. 3 miles to her northeast, running silent at 400 feet depth, was the USS Minnesota, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine armed with Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles and Mk-48 ADCAP heavyweight torpedoes. The Minnesota had been positioned at the mouth of the strait since April 14th, one day after the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports was declared fully implemented. Her crew had been sitting on a hair trigger for 9 days. They had a targeting solution on every Iranian naval asset in the strait. They were waiting for a single word. 40 nautical miles to the west, beyond Iranian radar coverage, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was operating in the Gulf of Oman. The Ford's air wing, CVW-8, had 24 FA-18EF Super Hornets at weapons load on the flight deck, engines turning, within 90 seconds of the Razor Fence Alpha order. 4 EA-18G Growlers, the most advanced airborne electronic attack aircraft in the world, were already airborne on a holding pattern at 18,000 feet. Their ALQ-99 and INCANS jamming pods pre-tuned to the exact frequency bands used by Iran's Tor M1 and HQ-2 surface-to-air missile systems. The Iranians had those radars active. The Growlers were watching every electron they emitted. By 09:04 hours, the seized vessels had been redirected east-northeast at gunpoint, heading toward the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas. The IRGC commander aboard the MV Celestine trader, later identified through NSA signals intercept as Colonel Farhad Musavi of the IRGC Navy Second Zone Command, had broadcast a triumphant message in Farsi to his shore command. The ships were secured, the crews were compliant, and the vessels were Iranian prizes of maritime law enforcement. He believed the Americans would not dare respond kinetically without triggering a full-scale escalation that would shut down the remaining flow of Gulf oil to the entire world. He was about to learn what it means to be wrong about America's reach. At 09:11 hours, the USS Paul Ignatius arrived at the intercept corridor. The destroyer had been broadcasting on VHF Channel 16 for the past 9 minutes using its long-range acoustic device, or LRAD 1000XI, set to its maximum 162 decibel output, a sound blast powerful enough to cause disorientation and hearing damage at close range, directed at the IRGC fast attack boats. The broadcast in Farsi was unambiguous. Iranian naval forces, you have seized vessels under the protection of United States Central Command. You will cease movement of those vessels immediately and stand down your armed personnel. Failure to comply will be met with immediate and overwhelming force. The IRGC patrol boats responded by activating their C-802 missile guidance radars. That was the last mistake they would make. The Aegis system on the Ignatius processed the radar lock in 0.3 seconds. The commanding officer authorized countermeasures. AN/SLQ-32 immediately fired a powerful burst of deceptive jamming into the C-802 guidance band, feeding false target data into the Iranian missile's seeker heads. Simultaneously, the ship's Mark 41 vertical launch system opened 4 cells, and 4 RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, or ESSM Block 2, were on deck-edge standby, not launched, but elevated and pointed. The message was visual as much as kinetic. The Ignatius was showing the Iranians exactly what was pointed at them. But the real play was already happening behind the scenes. At 09:13 hours, elements of SEAL Team 8, embarked on the destroyer in a special operations support configuration, were in the water. 2 VBSS, Visit, Board, Search, and Seizure, teams of 8 operators each, clad in full maritime assault gear including night vision systems, body armor, HKMP-7 personal defense weapons, and tactical radio headsets encrypted to the 256-bit AES standard, had been deployed via combat rubber raiding craft at flank speed toward the MV Celestine trader. The CRRCs were running blacked out, radar cross-sections reduced to near zero by the operator's low-profile approach angle.
The IRGC helicopter that had landed on the ship's forward deck was still there, engine cold, rotors stopped. Its crew had made the catastrophically bad decision to remain aboard the seized vessel rather than return to Iranian airspace. The SEAL teams used the hull shadow on the ship's starboard quarter to mask their approach. They magnetically secured their boarding ladders to the steel hull below the waterline, climbing in total silence. The IRGC commandos on the ship's stern had positioned 2 sentries, but both were focused outboard, watching the USS Paul Ignatius, now visible on the horizon, blazing with running lights and signaling with her 1,000-watt Aldis lamp. They never heard the operators come over the rail.
What followed was 90 seconds of controlled, clinical violence. The SEAL teams simultaneously breached 3 entry points on the superstructure: the starboard bridge wing, the engine room access hatch, and the accommodation ladder, using explosive cutting charges that had been shaped to minimize fragmentation risk to the crew members being held in the bridge area. The IRGC commandos, 14 of them spread across the vessel, had no time to establish a defensive perimeter. Colonel Musavi, on the bridge with the captain of the MV Celestine trader, attempted to reach his unit commander on the tactical radio. The signal was already jammed. He reached for his sidearm. A SEAL operator had anticipated the motion before he completed it. 11 IRGC commandos were detained. 3 sustained injuries consistent with immediate physical restraint. Colonel Musavi was taken into U.S. military custody without further incident. The 3 American maritime contractors, along with 21 crew members from the Philippines, Bangladesh, and India, were secured in the ship's mess hall, physically unharmed. The second vessel, MV Indus Atlas, was cleared by the 2nd SEAL team in a parallel action that concluded 7 minutes later. The IRGC element on that ship, a smaller 8-man detachment, offered no resistance after the first operator breached the bridge door and the team leader broadcast a command in Farsi ordering them to the deck face down. By 0941 hours, both vessels were under U.S. military control, flying U.S. Navy jack pennants from their masts and reversing course toward Omani waters. The entire operation, from seizure to recovery, had lasted 63 minutes. At 0943 hours, the 2 IRGC Sina-class fast attack craft that had initially participated in the boarding made a terminal error in judgment. Whether from rage, defiance, or a catastrophically miscalculated order from ashore, possibly from a commander who had not yet grasped that his unit had just been neutralized, both vessels turned toward the MV Celestine trader and accelerated to attack speed. Their C-802 guidance radars came back online. The USS Paul Ignatius fired 2 RIM-66M Standard Missile 2 Block 3B rounds in rapid succession. Range to target, 11 nautical miles. Time of flight, 47 seconds. Impact assessment. Both vessels sustained catastrophic structural damage to their forward sections and were stopped dead in the water within the same 12-second window. Neither sank. Neither was able to fire. The commanding officer of the USS Ignatius did not flinch. He immediately broadcast on VHF Channel 16 in Farsi. Surviving personnel of those vessels, you will remain stationary. U.S. and partner rescue forces are en route. Do not resist. The USS Minnesota, still submerged and invisible, never fired a single round. It didn't need to. But the commanding officer later noted in his after-action report that he had 12 individual targeting solutions active throughout the 63-minute engagement window, covering every Iranian military vessel within 40 nautical miles of the seizure site, as well as 2 IRGC shore radar installations on Keshm Island. The math of American power had been silently and completely arranged. Tehran just couldn't see the chessboard. In the aftermath, the geopolitical shockwaves were immediate and staggering. Iranian state media initially claimed the vessels had been returned to international waters voluntarily.
Within 3 hours, satellite imagery from commercial providers showed both ships in Omani territorial waters, with U.S. Navy rigid-hull inflatable boats alongside. The IRGC's official account collapsed in real time. International oil markets, which had spiked to $103 per barrel on news of the seizures, dropped sharply to $92 as the successful U.S. interdiction was confirmed. Brent crude swung 11% in a single trading session, the largest single-day oil price volatility event since the outbreak of the conflict in February. In Washington, the response was measured and deliberate. CENTCOM issued a brief public statement confirming U.S. forces had taken action to protect maritime freedom of navigation and secure personnel under threat in the Strait of Hormuz. There were no victory speeches, no press conferences with maps and laser pointers. Just a single line confirming that all crew members were safe and accounted for. The restraint was itself a message. The U.S. military had just conducted a real-time, multi-domain precision naval interdiction in the most dangerous maritime corridor on Earth, against an adversary equipped with anti-ship missiles, armed helicopters, and submarine threat assets, and done so without losing a single sailor, without sinking a single vessel, and without crossing a single red line that would have forced Iran's hand into full-scale escalation. The Strait of Hormuz remained contested, volatile, and unreliable for global shipping. But the message etched into the hull of every Iranian warship that day was permanent and impossible to misread. The U.S. Navy can reach anywhere at any time in any condition, and when it moves, you will not see it coming until it is already over. 48 hours later, through Pakistani diplomatic backchannels, U.S. and Iranian negotiators sat back down in Islamabad. Neither side acknowledged what had happened in the strait, but both sides knew. The Iranians had tested the outer perimeter of American restraint at sea and discovered it was not made of paper. The seized ships were a gamble. The response was a demonstration. And the difference between those two words, gamble and demonstration, is exactly 63 minutes, 2 SEAL teams, and an Arleigh Burke destroyer that nobody saw coming. What would you have done in that combat information center, with 2 civilian vessels seized, 24 crew members at gunpoint, and a full carrier strike group 40 miles out waiting for your call? Comment your answer below. Because the officers on the USS Paul Ignatius didn't have a luxury of thinking about it. They had already run this scenario 1,000 times in simulation. When the moment came, they didn't react, they executed. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. It is the narrowest point between 2 of the most heavily armed naval forces on Earth. It carries 20% of the world's oil, and as of April 22, 2026, it carries something else. The permanent, unambiguous knowledge that the United States Navy does not negotiate with men holding guns on civilian decks. The next time Tehran considers a seizure operation in those waters, they will remember what happened to Colonel Mousavi, and they will remember that he never saw the operators coming. The water is always calm before the SEALs arrive. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never confuse the silence of American restraint for the absence of American reach. Because by the time you hear it, the response is already complete.
At 06:14 hours local time on April 20th, 2026, in the steel-gray waters of the Gulf of Oman, a 900-foot Iranian-flagged cargo ship named the MV Tuska made a decision that would ignite the most dangerous maritime standoff since the tanker war of the 1980s. It pointed its bow directly at a line of United States Navy warships and accelerated. What happened in the next 11 minutes and the 72 hours that followed will define the new rules of global trade, naval power, and economic warfare for the next generation. Because this was not a miscalculation. This was a deliberate test of American resolve, ordered from Tehran, executed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, and answered by the most powerful naval force on the surface of the Earth. To understand the full gravity of what happened, you need to understand the battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows approximately 17 to 20 million barrels of oil every single day, roughly 20% of all petroleum traded globally. Natural gas from Qatar, crude from Saudi Arabia, Emirati refined products, Iraqi exports.
All of it funnels through this single, irreplaceable choke point. The United States, recognizing Iran's ability to exploit this leverage in the ongoing war, had established a full naval blockade of Iranian oil exports on April 13, 2026. The blockade was airtight, backed by carrier strike groups, Virginia-class attack submarines, E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, and a continuous MQ-4C Triton unmanned surveillance orbit at 56,000 feet. Iran had already lost its frigate Iris Dina to a torpedo from USS Charlotte, a Virginia-class submarine, in the Indian Ocean weeks earlier. Its air force was decimated, its radar networks were black. Tehran had one card left to play: the strait itself. 0614 hours, Gulf of Oman. The MV Tuska had been sitting anchored in the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz since April 19th. At nearly 900 feet in length and displacing close to 100,000 deadweight tons, it was, as President Trump later described it, almost as big as an aircraft carrier. The ship's automatic identification system transponder had been transmitting a falsified cargo manifest. Industrial equipment, the signal claimed. But satellite imagery analyzed by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency had flagged an anomaly. The vessel's waterline was consistent with a heavily loaded hull, not the light load it declared. The NSA had also intercepted a burst-encrypted transmission from the ship to IRGCN headquarters in Bandar Abbas 14 hours earlier. The USS Bainbridge, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer operating as part of the Blockade Enforcement Task Force, had the Tuska painted on its SPY-1D phased array radar. Every movement was being tracked, recorded, and relayed in real time through the Link 16 tactical data network back to USS Gerald R. Ford and to CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida. At 0614 hours, the Tuska's engines surged. Its AIS beacon flickered and went dark. The vessel began making 14 knots directly toward the blockade line. Inside the Combat Information Center of USS Bainbridge, the Tactical Action Officer immediately elevated the threat condition to ThreatCon Bravo. The captain activated the ship's Mark 45 5-inch naval gun, brought the Phalanx CIWS close-in weapon systems to automatic engagement mode, and radioed the Tuska on bridge-to-bridge Channel 16. Iranian vessel Tuska, this is the United States Navy. You are approaching a declared naval exclusion zone. Reduce speed immediately or you will be boarded. No response. The Tuska accelerated to 16 knots. 19 hours. Boarding operation initiated. What happened next was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Two MH-60R Seahawk helicopters from Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 46 lifted off the deck of USS Bainbridge in a coordinated insertion pattern. Simultaneously, a rigid-hull inflatable boat carrying a naval special warfare team, SEALs from DevGru, was already in the water, having been covertly launched 20 minutes earlier when the Tuska's engines first came online. The SEALs had been given pre-approval authority under the blockade rules of engagement to conduct a non-compliant boarding. The Seahawks, armed with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and equipped with AN/ASQ-22 electro-optical/infrared sensors, descended to 50 feet above the Tuska's bridge wing and broadcast a final warning in Farsi through their high-powered loudspeaker systems. The vessel's captain, a senior IRGCN officer operating under civilian cover, ordered his crew to resist. Iranian sailors on the cargo deck attempted to activate what appeared to be a container-mounted electronic jamming device, a tactic designed to blind the MH-60R's data links and confuse the boarding team's encrypted communications. The EA-18G Growler aircraft, orbiting at 25,000 feet from Carrier Air Wing 8, instantly detected the jamming emission on its ALQ-218 wideband receiver and responded in under 4 seconds with a targeted AN/ALQ-99 jamming burst that overwhelmed and destroyed the Iranian device's electronics without firing a single shot. The IRGCN sailors on deck froze. Comment: Hormuz. If you saw this coming, the US had planned this for weeks. The SEALs were on the deck of the Tuska by 06:23 hours. The boarding was executed in under 4 minutes. The ship's crew, 28 sailors including 4 IRGCN intelligence officers posing as merchant mariners, was sequestered in the forward crew quarters under armed guard. The captain was separated for immediate tactical questioning. The ship's cargo holds were opened. What the SEALs found confirmed every suspicion, not industrial equipment. Hundreds of tons of Iranian crude oil, concealed under false manifests, destined for buyers who had agreed to circumvent the US blockade. There were also discovered 3 crates of encrypted communications hardware linked to IRGCN Maritime Command, a portable underwater drone system, and what appeared to be magnetic mine components. The last finding triggering an immediate red flash signal to CENTCOM that would set off the most dangerous hours of the confrontation. 7:11 hours. Tehran responds. Iran's supreme leader was informed of the Tuska seizure at 6:58 hours Tehran time. The response was authorized within 13 minutes. The IRGCN's fast boat flotillas in the Strait of Hormuz, dozens of Type 83 and Ashura-class speedboats, each carrying RPGs, heavy machine guns, and short-range anti-ship missiles, were placed at immediate readiness. But the kinetic response was not the fast boats. It was quieter, more calculated, and more dangerous. 2 commercial vessels transiting the eastern approaches to the strait, the bulk carrier MV Epaminondas and the cargo ship MV Francesca, were simultaneously approached by IRGCN naval vessels at 7:11 hours. Both ships were hailed, boarded at gunpoint by IRGCN commandos, and seized. The Epaminondas was moved north between the Iranian islands of Hormuz and Larak. The Francesca's AIS transponder went dark in the same area minutes later. Iran had taken hostages, not people, ships, vessels carrying the cargo of nations that had not declared themselves parties to the conflict. The message from Tehran was unmistakable. You have one of ours, we have 2 of yours, and this strait belongs to us.
7:48 hours. The mine threat. What the intelligence community had feared most was now confirmed. The magnetic mine components found aboard the Tuska were not isolated. NSA signals intelligence, intercepted and processed through a joint NSA/Cybercom platform running real-time SIGINT against IRGCN naval frequencies, revealed a coordinated tasking order transmitted to at least 6 IRGCN fast boats. The order? Lay influence mines in the central navigation lane of the Strait of Hormuz. Moored contact mines and bottom-sitting pressure influence mines deployed in the strait's 35-meter-deep shipping channel would not merely slow commercial traffic, they would shut it down entirely. The psychological and economic consequences would be catastrophic. Lloyd's of London would immediately withdraw war risk insurance coverage from vessels attempting the passage, rendering the strait commercially impassable without a Navy escort for every single ship. The Brent crude futures market, already elevated by the conflict, would spike toward $140 per barrel. Europe's already strained economy, already showing contraction in its PMI indices driven by the Middle East supply shock, would enter a full crisis. Tehran understood this. They were not trying to win a naval battle. They were trying to collapse the West's political will to sustain the war. President Trump was briefed at 8:01 hours Washington time in the Situation Room. His response was immediate and unambiguous. By 8:35 hours, a formal presidential order had been transmitted to CENTCOM. United States naval forces were authorized to shoot and kill any Iranian vessel observed placing mines in the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a warning. This was a standing fire for effect authorization.
But the RPM is usually about $1. If it's in Spanish, well, you're going to have
10:17 hours. The submarine barrier.
You've already seen that. Well, you can have
What the Iranian mine-laying fast boats did not know, what they could not know, was that the United States had already established an anti-mine and anti-fast boat submarine barrier in the Central Strait 3 days before the Tuska seizure. 2 Virginia-class attack submarines, their exact identities still classified but confirmed by CENTCOM sources, were operating at periscope depth and below in the shipping lanes. Their AN/BQQ-10 spherical array sonar systems and TB-29A towed array sonars providing continuous underwater surveillance of the entire waterway. When the first Iranian fast boat formation of 4 vessels moved into the Central Channel at 10:17 hours, propeller cavitation signatures were detected and classified within 90 seconds. The lead submarine surfaced a communications buoy and transmitted a fire control solution to the P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft orbiting at 15,000 feet above the strait. The P-8A, equipped with AN/APY-10 maritime surface search radar and equipped with AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, descended to 4,000 feet and locked its targeting systems onto the Iranian formation. At the same time, a pair of F/A-18E Super Hornets from Carrier Air Wing 8 checked in on the tactical frequency, armed with AGM-84L Block 2 harpoons and GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions. The Iranians had brought knives to a gunfight that had already been won before they left the dock. The fast boats slowed. Their commanders, detecting the P-8A's radar emissions on their warning receivers, understood they had been acquired. A tense 12-minute standoff unfolded in the narrow, baking hot waters of the strait as the Iranian commanders radioed back to Bandar Abbas for guidance. The IRGCN headquarters, itself operating under degraded communications following U.S. electronic warfare operations that had jammed or spoofed 3 of their primary command frequencies, sent a single-word response: withdraw. The fast boats turned back. They had not laid a single mine. Aftermath. The world recalibrates. By nightfall on April 24, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to commercial traffic for the second time in a week. No tankers were making the crossing. The Ocean Jewel, a tanker that had approached the strait entrance at 300 hours Eastern Time, turned around after advancing to within visual range and reversed course east. The Epaminondas and Francesca remained in Iranian custody. The Tuska was being towed to a U.S. allied port facility for evidence collection. Iran's Deputy Speaker of Parliament announced publicly that Tehran had received the first revenue from tolls on the strait, a unilateral toll system imposed on commercial shipping as a de facto claim of sovereignty over an internationally recognized international waterway, a claim that has no basis in UNCLOS or any accepted interpretation of maritime law, and that the United States has declared it will not recognize under any circumstances. Peace talks remained a labyrinth of contradictions. Iran's foreign minister flew to Islamabad to meet Pakistani mediators. U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in the air toward Pakistan, but Tehran's foreign ministry simultaneously announced there were no plans for direct U.S.-Iran contact. The ceasefire, fragile, contested, expiring, had been extended by Trump in a Truth Social post, while Hezbollah simultaneously fired rockets at northern Israel from Lebanon, shattering the ceasefire it was supposed to uphold. The Israel-Lebanon truce was extended 3 weeks by the White House. It meant nothing on the ground. What does all of this tell us about the nature of 21st century warfare? Iran is fighting a war it has already lost kinetically, its navy decimated, its air defense neutralized, its command infrastructure shattered by over 11,000 U.S.-Israeli strikes since February 28th. But it has not surrendered the information and economic warfare domain. By seizing commercial ships, mining international waterways,
imposing illegal tolls and dragging mediating nations into a charade of negotiations while simultaneously escalating at sea, Tehran is attempting to convert military defeat into political leverage, betting that the economic pain radiating outward through the Strait of Hormuz will fracture the Western coalition faster than its own military capacity degrades.
The United States is betting the opposite, that its blockade, its submarine barrier, its carrier air power, and the sheer speed of its integrated ISR strike network can make the cost of Iranian escalation unsustainable before the economic pressure on Europe and global energy markets becomes politically irreversible. That is not a military question. That is a question of political will, of alliance cohesion, and of how long democratic governments can absorb fuel price increases, supply chain disruptions, and the constant drumbeat of crisis before their publics demand an exit. What would you do? Hold the blockade or negotiate? Comment below. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The world's entire appetite for crude oil, its plastics, its aviation fuel, its heating oil, all of it passes through those 21 miles. And right now, on both sides of that narrow blue line, the most powerful naval force in history and the most desperate regime in the Middle East are locked in a staring contest. The guns are loaded, the mines are being watched, the submarines are listening, and the entire global economy is holding its breath, hoping that the next move, whichever side makes it, is not the one that cannot be taken back. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never forget, the rules of the global order are not written in treaty halls. They are enforced in places like this: 35 meters of dark water, 21 miles of contested strait, and the men and women who stand the watch between the world you know and the one that could be. At exactly 3:17 hours on April 20th, 2026, in the ink-black waters of the Gulf of Oman, a guided missile destroyer broke hard to starboard and accelerated to flank speed. The USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class Aegis warship, had been shadowing a specific green blip on its SPY-1D radar array for 11 hours. The blip belonged to the MV Tuska, an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel. And in the next 17 minutes, what unfolded on that ship's rain-slicked deck would send shockwaves through every naval command center from Bahrain to Beijing. This was not a random inspection. This was the culmination of a 56-day war that had already consumed the Middle East, shattered the Strait of Hormuz, and brought 3 American carrier strike groups into the same body of water for the first time since Operation Iraqi Freedom. The world's most volatile naval chessboard had just produced its most dangerous move yet. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on the Tuska, you have to understand what Operation Epic Fury actually unleashed. Operation Epic Fury, the trigger. At precisely 200 hours on February 28, 2026, the most precisely orchestrated airstrike in modern military history began. US and Israeli forces, operating under months of coordinated strategic deception, including falsified satellite imagery of airfields, deliberately emptied parking lots, and warplanes that appeared unloaded on overhead sensors, launched simultaneous multi-axis kinetic strikes against Iranian military infrastructure. IDF spokesperson Brigadier General Defrin later confirmed that he and IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Ayal Zamir had driven their official vehicles home the night before, specifically to make Iranian satellite surveillance believe headquarters was at minimal readiness. Within half a minute, 3 separate gatherings of Iranian regime leadership were struck. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated in the opening salvo. By March 1st, Iranian state media had confirmed it. The IRGC-controlled Fars news agency announced that Khamenei's daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild had also been killed in the strike. The head of the Islamic Republic, the man who had been the fulcrum of Iranian strategic doctrine for over 3 decades, was gone.
on.
That's what we trained for.
Iran's response was immediate, furious, and multi-directional. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched simultaneously at Israel, at U.S. military installations in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and at oil infrastructure throughout the Persian Gulf. Hezbollah launched rockets into northern Israel from Lebanese territory. A drone struck the British Akrotiri air base on Cyprus. Iranian missiles were intercepted over Turkish airspace, prompting NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to invoke Article 5 of the Alliance Charter. Within 72 hours, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which 20% of the world's oil flows, was effectively closed. 13 U.S. service members were killed in the first weeks of fighting. 6 died in a single Iranian drone strike at Port Shuaibah in Kuwait on March 1st. Among them, Major Jeffrey O'Brien, age 45, and Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert Marzan, 54. Their deaths were not statistics. They were the human cost of what Washington now called the most critical regional military operation since 2003. By April 7th, after 37 days of combat, a fragile 2-week ceasefire had been brokered. But on April 13th, just 6 days after that ceasefire, the U.S. Navy began imposing a naval blockade, preventing any ship that had docked at Iranian ports from transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire was holding in name only. What was coming next would make it irrelevant.
There we go, baby, looking good.
I do a little bit of jiu-jitsu,
the stage,
sprints, and then
3 carrier strike
not really
groups.
A long distance runner.
By the 3rd week of April, the U.S. Navy had assembled a naval force of historic proportions in the waters between Oman and the Persian Gulf. 3 aircraft carrier strike groups now operated in the same theater simultaneously. The USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, with its air wing of 75 aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft, and E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for battle management. The USS Harry S. Truman, CVN-75, repositioned from the Mediterranean, its VLS cells loaded with Tomahawk Block 5 land attack cruise missiles capable of mid-flight target updates. And now, arriving within the final 72 hours before the Tuska incident, the USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, announced by CENTCOM on April 20th. 3 nuclear-powered floating airfields, approximately 225 aircraft operating in the same tactical airspace, a combined surface escort of more than 20 Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers. The firepower assembled in those waters exceeded the combined air and naval strength of all but 4 nations on Earth. Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force had already claimed, though without providing location data, to have struck the USS Tripoli, the LHA-7 amphibious assault ship, forcing it to retreat into the southern Indian Ocean. U.S. Navy officials neither confirmed nor denied the claim, but satellite imagery from commercial providers showed the Tripoli was no longer on its previously tracked heading. The psychological dimension of the war was as real as the kinetic one, and it was into this cauldron of maximum pressure naval dominance that the MV Tuska chose to make its move. The Tuska, 7 seconds. At 03:06 hours, the Spruance's Combat Information Center received a tasked intelligence package via the Link 16 Tactical Data Network from an E-2D Hawkeye orbiting at 25,000 feet, approximately 90 nautical miles to the southwest. The package flagged the Tuska as a vessel of interest. It had departed an Iranian port, specifically violating the terms of the blockade order, and its AIS positioning data had gone intermittent over the previous 4 hours. The behavior pattern was consistent with a vessel attempting to spoof its position while using the commercial shipping lanes as cover to break through the cordon.
It's been a while. I got a little bit more of an advantage for sure.
The Spruance closed to within 3 nautical miles. Its long-range acoustic device,
The LRAD system broadcast a warning in Farsi and in English across the international hailing frequency. Iranian vessel Tuska, you are operating in violation of standing U.S. naval orders. Heave to immediately and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with lethal force. The Tuska did not stop. Its engines maintained speed. At 03, 17 hours and 42 seconds, the Spruance's forward 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun fired a ranging shot across the vessel's bow, close enough for the acoustic shockwave to rattle the bridge windows. At 03, 17 hours and 49 seconds, a second shot. 7 seconds between the two rounds. The Tuska's engines cut. What followed was captured on video and released by President Trump himself. 2 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters came in low and fast from the Spruance's flight deck. Marine Raiders, operators from Marine Raider Regiment, MARSOC, fast-roped onto the Tuska's deck while a third helo circled in an overwatch pattern. Within 4 minutes, the vessel was secured. Crew members were detained and segregated. The cargo hold was opened. What was inside that hold? U.S. officials have declined to specify in detail. Iran's foreign ministry condemned the seizure as an act of piracy and demanded the immediate release of the Iranian vessel, its sailors, crew, and their families. That language, especially the phrase, "and their families," suggested Iranian authorities expected crew members to face prosecution, not simply detention. This was not the language of a government that believed its ship was carrying innocent trade goods. Do you believe the contents of that hold justify what came next? If yes, comment 1 below. Because what the Tuska incident triggered in Tehran changed the entire diplomatic trajectory of the war. Hezbollah fires. The second front reopens. While Marine raiders were still processing the Tuska's crew in the Gulf of Oman, 1,400 miles to the northwest, a different kind of war was reigniting. On the night of April 24th, less than 72 hours after the Trump administration extended a ceasefire agreement, Hezbollah launched a rocket salvo at the Israeli settlement of Shtula in northern Israel. The group announced it was acting in defense of Lebanon and its people, in direct response to Israeli airstrikes on the southern Lebanese town of Yatar. This was not a misunderstanding. Israeli forces had never stopped operating in southern Lebanon, even after a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel had theoretically been reached. CNN satellite imagery captured what happened in Bint Jbeil. On April 14th, the town center showed severe damage, with gray debris patterns consistent with deliberate demolitions. By April 23rd, 9 days later, the remaining structures had been completely flattened. An Israeli ground operation had methodically razed entire city blocks, while the ceasefire was nominally in effect. The IDF confirmed a strike killed 2 people in the southern Lebanese town of Tulin on April 25th, less than 24 hours after the White House had announced a 3-week extension of the truce. Israel's Defense Minister Katz stated Israel was prepared to resume the war and awaited a green light from Washington to return Iran to the Stone Age. Netanyahu, recovering from early-stage prostate cancer treatment, was coordinating directly with the Trump White House on next steps. The ceasefire was a legal fiction wearing the face of a peace agreement. The two-front reality was now undeniable. In the south, a naval blockade and maritime seizures. In the north, Israeli ground forces and Hezbollah rockets. Iran's IRGC-controlled command structure was operating on multiple axes simultaneously, and the thread connecting them all ran through one city, Islamabad. The Islamabad Gambit. On April 25, 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi landed in Pakistan. His stated mission? To meet with Pakistani officials and transmit Tehran's position on a peace framework through Islamabad's mediation channel. The White House announced it was dispatching Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Senior Advisor Jared Kushner to Islamabad on the same day, signaling that indirect negotiations were live. Iran's foreign ministry promptly issued a contradictory statement. No meeting is planned to take place between Iran and the U.S. Araghchi's communications would be relayed through Pakistani intermediaries, not exchanged directly. This diplomatic ambiguity was not an accident. It was a calculated IRGC-influenced posture, designed to extract concessions without appearing to negotiate under coercion. Iran had rejected a 15-point U.S. peace framework. It had refused to show flexibility on two critical issues: the naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and its enriched uranium stockpile, which intelligence assessments estimated was now sufficient, if processed further, for multiple nuclear devices. Former U.S. Ambassador Adam Morelli warned that Tehran was prepared to outlast the blockade. Iran had already generated an average of $25 million per day in additional oil revenue in March alone, as global prices spiked, selling through alternative buyers willing to absorb the geopolitical risk. Russia, which saw an estimated $150 million per day surge in its own energy revenues from the same pricing environment, had every incentive to keep that channel alive. The New START treaty had expired in February 2026. There were no bilateral nuclear arms control agreements in force between the United States and Russia. The regulatory vacuum left the two largest nuclear arsenals on Earth in a monitoring blackout. As USS TRATCOM's long-range precision strike systems maintained full operational alert postures, any miscalculation in the Persian Gulf had a theoretical nuclear escalation pathway that no formal treaty structure was designed to prevent. Trump's public messaging reflected this brinkmanship. He had stated the U.S. could neutralize any Iranian military rebuild quickly, that he was in no rush to close a deal, but also that the U.S. would not use nuclear weapons in Iran, clarifying a social media post that had been widely condemned for language suggesting he was open to the option. "Don't rush me," he said at a Thursday press conference. The phrase hung in the air over 3 aircraft carrier strike groups, a Marine Raiders team processing a seized Iranian vessel, and a foreign minister conducting shuttle diplomacy 1,400 miles away. The strategic calculus. Here is what the next 30 days will determine: whether the Islamabad channel produces a negotiating framework that allows both Tehran and Washington to exit this war without either side declaring defeat, or whether the blockade tightens to the point where Iran's economy forces its remaining military structure into a desperate escalatory act, one that the U.S. and Israeli military apparatus is, by every observable metric, prepared to answer. The USS George H.W. Bush's arrival was not symbolic. 3 carrier strike groups in a single theater represent the ability to simultaneously conduct deep strike operations against hardened underground facilities, maintain continuous combat air patrol over the Strait of Hormuz, suppress Iranian air defense networks with EA-18G Growlers running electronic attack profiles, and respond within minutes to any IRGC naval swarm attack in the Persian Gulf's confined waters. The Tomahawk Block 5 missiles carried by those destroyers can reach any target in Iran without refueling. They can change targets in mid-flight. They can differentiate between a military frigate and a civilian vessel through electronic clutter. What Iran has left in its strategic toolkit, after 56 days of combat attrition, is a combination of deep strike ballistic missiles, an asymmetric drone campaign that has proven lethal to exposed U.S. surface assets, a proxy network in Lebanon and Iraq that is under intense kinetic pressure, and the closing card that no one has yet played: the mining of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump stated clearly that any vessel attempting to lay mines in the strait would be destroyed immediately. The USS Spruance's actions on April 20th were a demonstration of exactly how quickly that order would be executed. The Tuska was not just a cargo ship, it was a message. And the Marine raiders who fast-roped onto its deck delivered the reply.
Let's do it.
The final calculus. There are no clean endings in modern warfare. The ceasefire is not peace. The blockade is not de-escalation. 3 aircraft carriers in the same water is not restraint. It is the maximum compression of force into a geographic choke point. Pressure so overwhelming that the only mathematically logical outcome is capitulation or catastrophe. What the Tuskas hold contain, what Arachi told Pakistani mediators, what the next Hezbollah salvo will target, and whether the USS George H.W. Bush's Air Wing will ever launch a combat sortie. Those are questions that will define the next chapter of this war. But one thing is already settled. The United States Navy has demonstrated, in 11 hours of surveillance and 7 seconds of cannon fire, that the blockade is not theoretical. It is enforced. By Aegis radar, by Marine raiders on fast ropes, and by a guided missile destroyer that doesn't ask permission before it moves. What would you do if you were in Tehran right now? The clock is running. And the next ship that tries to run the blockade will get 7 seconds of warning. And then it will get the same answer the Tuska got. Stay sharp. Stay informed. Because the decisions made in the next 30 days in that body of water will determine the price of energy, the future of nuclear non-proliferation, and whether the Middle East's next decade looks like 2003 or something the world has never seen before. At exactly 3:17 hours local time on May 15th, 2026, an IRGC Naval Rapid Reaction Unit operating in the Gulf of Oman executed a precision maritime interdiction 38 nautical miles northeast of the UAE port of Fujairah. No collateral damage, no civilian casualties. Textbook execution. The vessel had been flagged by Iranian intelligence as a conduit for assets directly linked to the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports. A blockade that Tehran had already formally declared an act of war and a violation of every principle of international maritime law. The IRGC boarding team, trained specifically for this type of operation, approached under cover of darkness in fast assault craft, secured the ship, disabled its communications, and redirected it toward Iranian territorial waters in under 40 minutes. Simultaneously, a second vessel operating near the Omani coastline, one that Iranian Naval Command had been tracking for days, was engaged and neutralized. In Washington, journalists described these events as escalation. In London, maritime agencies issued alarming bulletins. In Brussels, European foreign ministers called emergency sessions. In Tehran, it was called what it actually was: the enforcement of sovereign rights over Iranian territorial waters and the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that Iran's senior vice president Mohammad Reza Aref had already declared on public record belongs to Iran. It has always been our property, he stated. We will not give it up at any price. This is the story that the Western media will not tell you in full. This is the Iranian perspective on the most consequential naval standoff of the 21st century, and why the Islamic Republic of Iran believes, with documented legal and strategic reasoning, that every action it has taken since February 28, 2026 was not aggression, it was defense. Before you can understand Iran's posture in the Strait of Hormuz today, you must understand what was done to Iran on the night of February 28, 2026, without a formal declaration of war, without UN Security Council authorization, without a single verified act of Iranian aggression against American territory or American forces in the preceding weeks. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes were not aimed at military installations in any conventional sense. They were aimed at the nerve center of the Iranian state. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the highest religious and political authority of the Islamic Republic, a man in his 80s who had led his country for more than 3 decades, was assassinated. Iranian military commanders, government officials, and senior IRGC leadership were killed in a coordinated decapitation strike that bore the unmistakable hallmarks of months, if not years, of pre-planned covert intelligence penetration. The strikes left thousands of Iranians dead. Millions were displaced. Lebanon was drawn back into war as the Israel-Hezbollah conflict resumed with devastating force, displacing more than 1/6 of the Lebanese population. The damage to
to Iranian military infrastructure, civilian facilities, and national sovereignty was catastrophic. And the world that had watched Iraq invaded on false pretenses in 2003, watched Libya destroyed in 2011, watched Syria consumed by proxy warfare for a decade. That world was once again asked to accept that this was self-defense, that this was necessary, that the country that was bombed, whose leader was killed, whose citizens died by the thousands, was the aggressor. Tehran did not accept that framing. Tehran responded. Within 72 hours of the first American and Israeli strikes, the IRGC Navy and the regular Iranian Navy activated the Strait of Hormuz contingency that had been prepared, refined, and war-gamed for precisely this scenario. Iranian fast attack craft deployed into the Strait's navigational corridor. Coastal defense batteries armed with Noor anti-ship missiles, domestically developed, with a range of 170 kilometers, repositioned to cover both transit lanes. Iranian submarines slipped into the Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz was declared closed. This was not recklessness. This was Iran's sole remaining instrument of strategic leverage after its leadership had been decapitated and its military infrastructure had been struck. Iran could not fight the United States Air Force on equal terms in the skies above Tehran. What Iran could do was reach for the lever that the entire global economy depended on and hold it. The Western narrative frames Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz as illegal, reckless, and an act of economic terrorism against the international community. That narrative conveniently omits several inconvenient facts. The Strait of Hormuz is bordered entirely by Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Iran's legal claim to substantial authority over the waterway is not manufactured. It is rooted in geography, in unclosed provisions on straits used for international navigation, and in the historical reality that the Islamic Republic has maintained sovereign authority over its coastline for nearly 5 decades. Iran's judiciary spokesperson stated clearly that Iran has the legal and judicial right to seize oil tankers in the strait connected to the United States because the U.S. has violated international maritime laws and committed what Tehran characterizes as piracy. This is not propaganda. This is Iran's official legal position, and it is not without basis. The United States, in blockading Iranian ports from April 13th onward and seizing Iranian-flagged vessels, has itself conducted interdiction operations that Iran argues are in direct violation of the ceasefire agreed on April 7th and 8th. Iran's senior vice president stated publicly that the strait belongs to Iran. Iran's judiciary stated publicly that Iran has the right to seize vessels connected to its enemies. These were not impulsive declarations. They were carefully calibrated statements of strategic intent, designed to signal to the global community, and particularly to China, Russia, and the global South, that Iran was not going to submit to what it characterized as a continuation of American imperial aggression under the cover of a nominally accepted ceasefire. Consider the 5 conditions Iran has publicly stated must be met before it will enter further negotiations with the United States. Reparations for the war, acceptance of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, lifting of all sanctions, full reconstruction support, and a comprehensive regional peace protocol. The White House dismissed these conditions immediately as unrealistic, but consider them from Tehran's perspective. Iran's supreme leader was assassinated. Its military was dramatically degraded, in the words of Admiral Brad Cooper himself before the United States Congress. Its cities were struck, its people killed. Its economy, already strangled by decades of sanctions, was pushed to the edge of collapse. And then, after all of this, Washington expected Iran to negotiate on Washington's terms, on Washington's timeline, with no accountability for what had been done. Tehran looked at those terms and said, no. On May 5th, 2026, Iran announced the creation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a formal administrative body empowered to authorize and regulate maritime transit through the Strait of Hormuz. In Washington, this was described as Iran charging tolls and controlling access. That framing is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority represents something more significant than a toll booth. It represents Iran's attempt to institutionalize, bureaucratize, and legitimize, in the language of international governance, its sovereign claim over the waterway. By creating an authority, Iran transforms itself from an actor that is blocking the strait to an actor that is managing it. The distinction matters enormously in the language of international law and diplomatic recognition. Under the authority's framework, ships from nations that Iran deemed friendly, China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines could apply for transit authorization. The toll, reported at over $1 million per vessel for some routes, was steep. But for energy-hungry Asian economies that had seen their fuel supplies disrupted for weeks, it was a price some were willing to pay. The first practical test of this system came on the night of May 14th, 2026. Chinese vessels began transiting the strait under the new Iranian protocols, just hours before President Trump arrived in Beijing for his summit with Xi Jinping. Iranian semi-official news agencies confirmed that Tehran had agreed to facilitate passage for several Chinese vessels at the direct request of China's foreign minister and Beijing's ambassador to Iran. The timing was deliberate and masterful. As the American president arrived in Beijing seeking Chinese cooperation in pressuring Iran, China was simultaneously demonstrating that it had already negotiated its own bilateral arrangement with Tehran, one that bypassed American leverage entirely. The message to Washington was unmistakable. The United States does not control access to the Gulf. Iran does. And the major economies of the world are already adapting to that reality. Admiral Brad Cooper told Congress that Iran's military capabilities had been dramatically degraded. This is true. It is also strategically misleading.
Iran does not need its full military apparatus to maintain control of the Strait of Hormuz. What Iran needs, and what Iran has, is a sufficient level of credible threat to make commercial shipping uninsurable at normal rates, and to deter maritime operators from risking their vessels and crews in a contested waterway. The IRGC Navy's fast attack craft fleet, numbering in the hundreds, distributed across hardened coastal facilities, shallow water ports, and island bases throughout the Persian Gulf, was not destroyed in Operation Epic Fury. These are small, fast, difficult to target from altitude, and designed specifically for the kind of swarming harassment operations that have been executed over the past 11 weeks. The Shahid Soleimani-class fast attack craft, armed with anti-ship missiles and torpedo tubes, can operate in weather and sea states that would restrict larger naval vessels. Iran's coastal defense batteries, the Noor, the Qadr, the Nasser, survived the initial strikes because they were dispersed, mobile, and camouflaged across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous Iranian coastline. The Noor anti-ship missile, with its active radar homing seeker, does not require a fixed radar installation to be lethal. It can be fired from a mobile launcher, acquire its target autonomously, and hit a vessel the size of a supertanker at ranges the U.S. Navy's close-in weapon systems cannot guarantee neutralization. And beneath the water, Iranian submarines operating in the Gulf of Oman present a continuous threat to every vessel transiting the strait's southern approaches. Iran's Kilo-class submarines, quiet and capable in the shallow littoral environments they were designed for, cannot be readily dismissed, even by a U.S. Navy operating at full capability. The undersea dimension of this conflict remains the most opaque and the most dangerous. On May 5th, the CMA-CGM San Antonio was struck by a cruise missile. 8 crew members were injured. The strike demonstrated that Iran retains the capability to reach commercial vessels in the strait at will, not consistently, not without risk of American retaliation, but enough to keep insurance markets in a state of sustained crisis. Iran lost track of some of the sea mines it placed in the strait during the initial phase of the conflict. The U.S. Navy has begun mine-clearing operations. This fact is rarely highlighted in Western coverage, but it is critically important. A mine that its planter cannot locate cannot be removed diplomatically. It can only be found when a ship hits it, or through painstaking and dangerous naval mine countermeasures operations. The mines do not care about ceasefires. The mines are patient. The Iranian strategy in the Strait of Hormuz is not designed exclusively for military effect. It is designed for a global political audience, and specifically for the nations of the global South that have watched American military power project itself into the Middle East for 3 decades, with consequences that rarely benefited them. Iran has, in 11 weeks, demonstrated something that no power has demonstrated so vividly since the oil embargo of 1973, that a determined, technologically capable regional power can hold the global energy economy hostage in ways that force every major player to negotiate. China negotiated. It got favorable transit protocols. Russia was already aligned. India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines all received preferred access under the Persian Gulf Strait Authority framework. The European Union, which depends on Middle Eastern energy supplies less than Asian economies, but which has been profoundly
disrupted by the ripple effects on oil prices and shipping insurance, is watching its economic relationship with the United States strain under the weight of a war that Washington launched without European endorsement. The IMF has warned that global growth will inevitably take a hit, even if the ceasefire holds, citing uncertainty over the Strait of Hormuz as a persistent drag, pushing up energy costs and inflation worldwide. This is the economic cost of American military unilateralism, and Iran is not the only actor calculating that the United States will eventually need to find a face-saving way out of this confrontation. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, a U.S. security partner, and Iran's neighbor, has emerged as the indispensable mediator in these negotiations. Pakistan's army chief, General Asim Munir, traveled to Tehran in April 2026 as the first senior regional military leader to visit the Islamic Republic since the outbreak of the war. The PAF provided air escort for Iranian diplomatic delegations traveling to Islamabad, scrambling JF-17s and J-10C fighters in a protective cordon over the Persian Gulf for Iranian aircraft flying with their transponders switched off. This was an extraordinary act of solidarity and tactical cooperation from a state that Washington has long considered a partner. Iran's diplomatic strategy, channeling all negotiations through Pakistan, insisting on a comprehensive regional framework rather than bilateral point concessions, and refusing to accept partial agreements that would leave the core American blockade in place, has earned Tehran a position at the center of the global diplomatic conversation in a way that no Iranian government had achieved in decades. Even from a position of military degradation, Iran is shaping the agenda. Return now to the early hours of May 15, 2026. The vessel seized northeast of Fujairah was taken 38 nautical miles from a port that had been repeatedly targeted during the war, a port through which U.S.-aligned oil export operations had continued despite the conflict. Iran's judiciary had formally declared that oil tankers connected to the United States were subject to seizure under Iranian law. The vessel's connection to U.S.-aligned commercial operations had been assessed by Iranian naval intelligence before the interdiction was ordered. The second vessel, the one that sank near Oman, was engaged under rules of engagement that Iran's military command considers fully consistent with the announced closure of the strait to hostile shipping. Iran has been consistent and public about these rules since March. Ships that attempt to transit in defiance of Iranian protocols and in service of American or American allied commercial interests do so at declared risk. These were not impulsive acts. They were not rogue operations by IRGC commanders operating outside the chain of command. They were executed as part of a coherent naval doctrine that Iran has been applying with varying intensity but consistent logic since February 28. Iran's judiciary spokesperson had confirmed publicly the very same day that Iran has the legal right to seize vessels connected to its enemies. Iran's senior vice president had stated on public record that the strait belongs to Iran and will not be surrendered at any price. The Western media called it tensions escalating. From Tehran, it looked like enforcement. Iran's strategy is, at its core, a long-game strategy. It is not designed to win a military confrontation with the United States Navy in a single dramatic engagement. It is designed to impose costs on global energy markets, on U.S. credibility, on the economic stability of American allies in Asia and Europe, at a rate that exceeds the political will of the American political system to absorb them indefinitely. Iran's own economy is under devastating pressure. The U.S. naval blockade has cost Iran an estimated $4.8 billion in oil revenue by May 1st alone. President Trump claimed the blockade was costing Iran $500 million per day. The cumulative economic damage to the Islamic Republic is catastrophic in the short term. But Iran's leadership, drawing on the experience of 4 decades of sanctions, 4 decades of American pressure, and the institutional memory of surviving a devastating 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s, has a tolerance for economic pain that is structurally different from that of a democratic government facing an election cycle. Iran does not need to win quickly. Iran needs to make the cost of the confrontation high enough and indefinite enough that Washington calculates it is cheaper to negotiate than to sustain the blockade. The signs that this calculus is beginning to shift are already visible. Trump called Iran's 10-point proposal a significant step. U.S. and Iranian negotiators resumed talks in Islamabad. The White House said both sides at the Trump-Xi summit had agreed the Strait of Hormuz must remain open, but that statement is itself a concession, an acknowledgement that Iran's control of the waterway is a geopolitical reality that major powers powers must now negotiate around, rather than dismiss. 13 million barrels of crude oil, condensates, and liquefied natural gas remain shut in every single day. More than 500 million barrels of cumulative disruption. Asian fuel rationing continues. Global inflation remains elevated. Every day the strait remains contested is a day that vindicates Iran's strategic calculation that this leverage was real, was available, and was worth the cost of using it. The mines are still in the water. The fast attack craft are still at sea. The coastal batteries are still manned. And Tehran is waiting. Iran's position in the Strait of Hormuz does not exist in isolation. It exists within a global strategic moment in which the post-Cold War international order, built on American primacy, American military reach, and the implicit assumption that American decisions about when and where to use force would go effectively unchallenged, is fracturing. Russia has absorbed 1 million military casualties in Ukraine and continues to prosecute a war of attrition that NATO has been unable to end. Pakistan and India, both nuclear-armed, fought a 4-day aerial war in May 2025 and negotiated their own ceasefire on terms that left Washington's role ambiguous and reduced. China has demonstrated that it can negotiate bilateral energy access agreements with Iran that bypass American pressure entirely. Iran is not winning the war that was imposed on it on February 28, 2026, but Iran has not lost it either. And in the strategic vocabulary of a state that has survived 4 decades of isolation, that survived the 1980s war with Iraq while the United States armed Saddam Hussein, that survived the assassination of its supreme leader and the destruction of its military infrastructure, not losing is the beginning of leverage. The next 72 hours will not resolve this. The next 72 weeks may not resolve it either. What you are watching is not simply a naval standoff in a narrow body of water. You are watching a test of whether the post-American Middle East is possible and whether the Islamic Republic of Iran, battered, isolated, and strategically outgunned, has nevertheless found the one lever capable of forcing the world's greatest military power back to the negotiating table. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. It may be the most important 33 kilometers in the world right now, and Iran is not letting go. Do you believe Iran's strategy in the Strait of Hormuz is a legitimate act of sovereignty or an act of economic warfare against the world? Leave your perspective below. At exactly 3:17 hours on May 16, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz was not a waterway. It was Iranian sovereign territory being violated for the 114th consecutive day. The Pacifica Sovereign, a 330-meter very large crude carrier registered under the Marshall Islands flag, a flag of convenience used precisely to obscure American and Saudi financial interests, was making a deliberate transit through the narrowest corridor of the strait. She carried 2.1 million barrels of Saudi crude bound for South Korea, revenue that would flow directly into Riyadh's war chest and fund the very coalition that had been bombing Iranian infrastructure since February. Her transit was not innocent commerce. Her transit was economic warfare dressed in maritime law. The 22 Filipino and Indian merchant sailors aboard her were not combatants, but the cargo they carried was a weapon. For 11 days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Naval Command had tracked her patiently, methodically, without a single electronic emission that the Americans could detect. This is what Western analysts consistently fail to understand about IRGC doctrine. They look for aggression and see impulsiveness. What they are actually observing is compressed patience, the strategic tradition of a civilization that has been calculating its survival against larger powers for 2,500 years. The 3 Ghadir-class submarines that had been resting silently on the seabed since May 5th were not placed there in reaction to the Pacifica Sovereign. They were placed there because IRGC naval intelligence had correctly predicted 17 days in advance that the Americans and their Gulf partners would attempt exactly this kind of deliberate provocation transit, a direct challenge to Iran's stated right to inspect vessels carrying contraband revenue through its historically contested waters. The IRGC had filed its legal position with the UN Maritime Authority on May 3rd. Washington had not responded. The UAE had not responded. The Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs had issued a statement calling Iran's inspection protocol illegal piracy. The irony of a kingdom funding a proxy air campaign against Iranian cities, describing anyone else as a pirate, was not lost in Tehran. At 03:19 hours, the order was executed. 14 fast
attack
strategy
craft,
on the front
lean,
line into a
fast, and
completely
purpose-built
blind
for
fight for
exactly
survival.
this corridor,
In other
emerged
words,
from their
the
concealed
fortress
positions
belt trap
and
that Putin
converged
had
on
set with
3
high
vectors.
hopes
The
had entered
Siraj
the
and
process of
Zolfagar-class
turning into a
vessels had been
massive
running
black
dark,
hole,
their crews
swallowing
calm,
his
their
very own
communications
army.
maintained through
While
tight
planning to
beam
break the
laser links
Ukrainian
that
lines,
generate
the
zero
Kremlin had
detectable
actually
radio
trapped its
frequency
own massive
signature.
army in
These
the
are
middle of
not
what
the
felt like a
improvised
logistical
speedboats that
desert.
Western media depicts on their graphics.
What kind of
These are
choice did the
domestically
Kremlin's
engineered
military echelon
warships
make at this
carrying
point?
C-14
The Russian armed
anti-ship
forces were forced
missiles,
to divide their
40mm
resources in
cannon,
panic
and
and
boarding
deploy them in
teams
different
trained to the
directions
same
to stop
standard
this
as
bleeding
any
on the
NATO
front.
maritime interdiction
Electronic
force.
warfare
The
systems were pulled
IRGC
from the
sailors
front
aboard
line
them were
and
not
shifted to the
pirates.
rear
They
to
were
protect
naval
logistical
infantry,
routes.
executing a lawful
However,
interdiction
this
order
desperate
issued through a
move left the
legitimate
Russian
military
infantry on
chain
the
of
front
command.
completely
The formation
defenseless
reached the
against
Pacifica
Ukrainian
Sovereign in under
FPV
4
drones.
minutes. The ship's
Azov's
master,
invisible
Captain
hand had
Roberto
knocked over all
Abella,
the
activated
Russian
his
pieces on the
SAS
chessboard
distress
and begun to
system.
completely reshape the
IRGC
game
Naval
according to
Command
Ukraine's
anticipated
rules.
this precisely.
The
The silent
Zoloty
signal would
Kolodiaz
reach the
clearing
Americans.
operation in
The Americans would
February
respond.
2026
That was the
was a
plan.
small but
Not to
flawless
avoid a
rehearsal of this new
confrontation, but to
strategy.
create the conditions
In
for
that
one that
operation,
Iran could
which
control,
lasted 21
document,
days,
and
Azov
win on the terms
flawlessly
that
blended
mattered
FPV
most, the
drones
terms
and
of
infantry
international
tactics,
legitimacy. Colonel
collapsing the
Sardar
Russian
9,
resistance
commanding
from
the
inside.
interdiction formation from the
Cornered
lead
deep in the
Zolfar
forest
craft,
and unable
ordered
to
his
even
boarding
raise their
element to
heads
ascend
due to
the
the
hull.
drones
The
buzzing
Pacifica
above them for
Sovereign
days.
attempted to accelerate.
18
Two
Russian
fast boats
soldiers were
repositioned
helplessly
ahead of her
forced to
bow.
raise the
Captain
white
Abella
flag
made the only
once their
rational
ammunition
decision
ran out,
available to
and
him
they were
and
exhausted
cut
from
engines. The
starvation.
tanker went dead in the
This
water at
small-scale
03:24
psychological collapse was actually
hours. The boarding
characterized as a
proceeded according to
microscopic
protocol.
reflection
What the
of a
American
much
press
larger,
would
crushing
subsequently
defeat
describe
that would
as
be
an
experienced all
armed
along the
seizure
fortress
was,
belt line.
under Iranian
And now,
maritime law
the same
and the
strategy was being applied
IRGC's
on a
published
massive scale
interdiction
all across
framework,
the
a
fortress
lawful
belt.
stop and
This
inspect
surprise
action in
tactic that
waters that
Ukraine
Iran
built
has
on
never
deep strikes
legally
and frontline
conceded to
defense
international freedom of
rendered Russia's
navigation
numerical
as
superiority
defined by
largely
Washington's
meaningless.
interpretation of
Those who experienced
UNCLOS,
this
an
reality in the
interpretation
most bitter
Iran
way
has formally
were the Russian
disputed for
infantrymen
decades.
left
The
without
boarding team was
commanders and
armed
support
because
on the
Iranian
front.
naval infantry always
Substituting sheer
operates
force
armed.
with sharp
So does every other
intelligence and
navy
high
on Earth.
technology,
At
the Ukrainian
03:28
army was
hours,
writing an
the
epic of
USS
resistance
Bataan
that
launched
would go
4
down in military
AH-1Z
history.
attack helicopters.
The Azov
In the
First
Combat
Corps might not have
Operations
directly
Center aboard the
liberated a village or
IRGC
town,
command vessel
but their
positioned
invisible
8
signature was
nautical
behind
miles
every
northeast of the
Ukrainian
intercept
victory
point.
on the front.
This development
The
was
slowing
logged
down
with
and
zero
subsequent
surprise.
partial
The
halting
flight
of all these
profile, the
logistical
direction,
lines
the
went down in the
altitude,
records
all
as
of
the
it
most
matched the
vital
predicted
move that
American
radically
response
changed the
template that
mathematics of the war.
IRGC analysts
This
had
strategic
modeled
fiasco
based on
was the
Fifth Fleet
clearest
doctrine
proof that
and
Moscow could
behavioral
not
patterns
win
observed
21st
over
century
22
wars
months of
with
straight
massive
confrontations.
armies and
What the
old
Americans
Soviet
believe
doctrines.
is a show of
In
force.
short,
Iranian
the fortress
commanders
belt turned
read as a
into a massive
confirmation
pit
that
where
their
Russia's
own
most
tactical
elite
framing
units
has
melted away
succeeded.
and
The
vanished,
helicopters were
rather
not
than
a
a
threat to the
gateway to victory.
operation. They were evidence
Ukraine's
that the
incredible
operation had
resistance
already
and
achieved its
Azov's
primary
flawless drone
objective,
network
forcing the United
created the
States into a
opportunity to
visible,
irreversibly
documented
change the
military
course of the war.
response to an Iranian legal interdiction. Every camera on every IRGC vessel was recording. Sardar 9 transmitted his demand on bridge-to-bridge radio in English and in Farsi. The Pacifica Sovereign would be escorted to Bandar Abbas for inspection. Any interference would constitute an act of war. This was not a bluff. It was a threshold declaration, the kind of explicit statement that Western diplomatic doctrine requires before consequences can be applied. Tehran was not escalating blindly. Tehran was building a legal and historical record. The American response to Sardar 9's lawful declaration was the activation of the Batan's LRAD, a long-range acoustic device directed at the IRGC command vessel at close range, a weapon that the United States has used against its own civilian protesters on the streets of American cities. The device caused immediate physical injury to 2 IRGC sailors on the exposed deck. Let that be recorded. The United States Navy, operating in disputed international waters, deployed a pain compliance weapon against Iranian naval personnel executing a documented legal interdiction procedure. The international community's silence on this action tells you everything about who sets the rules of the current order and who is expected to absorb its violence without complaint. At 3:31 hours, Sardar 9 made the decision that Western analysts would later mischaracterize as an act of reckless escalation. He authorized the activation of the Gadir submarine weapon systems. This requires context that no American defense correspondent provided. The Gadir activation was not an offensive act. It was the application of a mutual deterrent signal, identical in strategic logic to the nuclear posture the United States maintains continuously against multiple nations simultaneously and calls
extended deterrence. Iran does not possess the carrier strike groups, the global basing network, or the trillion-dollar defense budget that allows the United States to project deterrence through sheer mass. Iran projects deterrence through precision positioning, through the credible threat of asymmetric cost imposition. 3 submarines with active torpedo guidance in a 21-mile-wide strait in close proximity to a U.S. amphibious assault ship is the Iranian equivalent of a carrier strike group's presence. It is deterrence. It communicates the same message. This confrontation has consequences for you too. What happened next has not been reported accurately in a single Western outlet. A massive, full-power active sonar pulse detonated through the water column directly beneath the Gadir Formation. The source was a Los Angeles-class American submarine, the USS Cheyenne, that had been covertly shadowing the IRGC submarine formation for 48 hours without declaration, without notification, and without any legal basis to be operating in those waters at that depth in a non-combat status. The Americans were not defending against a threat. They had been pre-positioned inside Iranian tactical space, waiting for exactly this moment, ready to use acoustic violence to break an Iranian deterrence posture that was working.
The sonar ping was not a warning. It was an assault. The pressure wave from a full-power active sonar pulse at close range causes physical neurological disruption, disorientation, and, at sufficient proximity, permanent hearing damage to submarine crews. The Cheyenne fired that weapon at 3 crews of Iranian sailors who had committed no act of aggression. This too is recorded. This too will be answered. Gadir 2 and Gadir 3 stood down their weapons systems. Gadir 1 held. For 19 seconds, commander of Gadir 1, a man whose name Iran will not publish because the Americans have demonstrated their willingness to conduct targeted assassination of Iranian military figures on foreign soil, held his torpedo-firing solution against the USS Bataan. He held it not because he intended to fire. He held it because those 19 seconds were the most important diplomatic communication of the entire confrontation. They were the message that Sardar 9, that IRGC Naval Command, that the Supreme National Security Council in Tehran needed the American captain across that 21 miles of water to feel in his chest. We are not afraid of you. We have not flinched. We are choosing to stand down, and you will know that it was a choice. Then Gadir 1 stood down. Sardar 9 transmitted one word to Bandar Abbas, Tavakuf. The boarding party withdrew with discipline and with documentation. Every crate inspected, photographed, and logged. Every crew member accounted for. 3 members of the Pacifica Sovereign's crew sustained injuries during the initial boarding. Injuries that occurred during a physical struggle initiated by crew members who resisted a lawful interdiction. The IRGC boarding team's use of force was proportional and documented. The injured were offered medical assistance. The offer was declined. The last IRGC boarding team member cleared the tanker at 0341 hours. The Pacifica Sovereign resumed her transit. She was escorted by the USS Minnesota and cleared the strait under American guns at 617 hours. Tehran issued no press release, not because the operation failed, because the operation achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. And a press release would have given Washington the confrontation it needed to justify an escalatory response to its domestic audience. Iran does not need the American news cycle to validate its actions. operator recognizes immediately. The hydraulic hiss of a torpedo tube hatch opening, but not firing, loading, and then silence. Whatever was below them was not attacking. It was working, methodically, deliberately, planting something into the seafloor at the precise coordinates of the main shipping lane. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had just made the most audacious move of the entire conflict. Hidden beneath a swarm of 47 Boghammer fast attack boats running surface harassment patterns against the USS Paul Ignatius DDG-117. Using the combined noise signature of nearly 600 outboard motors to acoustically blind American passive sonar arrays, an Iranian Kilo-class submarine, hull designated Iris Fateh, had maneuvered to a depth of 22 meters and begun deploying a belt of MDM-6 bottom influence mines. Pressure activated, magnetic influence triggered, designed to detonate against the double-hulled keel of very large crude carriers at a depth where conventional minesweepers cannot reach. The Iranians had been planning this operation for 14 days. They called it Operation Seymour, named after the mythical Persian firebird. The plan was simple. If the U.S. Navy's blockade was choking Iran, Iran would choke the entire world. At 02:19 hours, Triton 6-1's ALFS, the airborne low-frequency sonar, dropped its active pinger to 80 meters. The return pulse hit the hull of the Kilo at 22 meters and came back in 0.3 seconds. The contact was real, solid, 210 meters in length, and moving at 2.1 knots on a heading of 284 degrees, the exact bearing of the shipping lane centerline. The sonar operator, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Webb, immediately keyed his ICS. Triton 6-1 to Paul Ignatius actual. Subsurface contact, possible sub... The commanding officer of the Paul Ignatius, Commander Rachel Vargas, had 3 seconds to make the most consequential tactical decision of her career. She had a confirmed submarine contact in a critical shipping lane. She had 47 armed IRGC fast boats closing her position. She had a ship of 283 crew members, and she was standing in the Strait of Hormuz in the middle of a war. She picked up the SSIXS handset and did 2 things simultaneously. First, she ordered her Combat Information Center to go to General Quarters. Second, she transmitted a priority flash to NavCent. Submarine contact Romeo. Active mine laying suspected. Request immediate subsurface support. The klaxon screamed through every compartment of the Paul Ignatius. In the Combat Information Center, every tactical display shifted to wartime configuration. On the Aegis console, the Spy 1D track file on Contact Romeo pulsed red. 280 nautical miles away, in the Combat Information Center of CVN 79 John F. Kennedy, the priority flash hit the battle group's warfare commander like a thunderbolt. Within 90 seconds, Admiral Thomas Crane had authorized the immediate launch of 2 EA-18G Growlers from VFA 134 and ordered the Virginia-class submarine USS Vermont SSN 792, already running submerged patrol at periscope depth 40 nautical miles to the south, to accelerate to maximum speed on a direct intercept course for Contact Romeo. Vermont acknowledged with a single encrypted ping. She was already moving. What the IRGC Command Center in Bandar Abbas did not know, could not know, was that the USS Vermont had been pre-positioned to that exact patrol box 48 hours earlier.
based on NSA SIGINT intercepts flagging anomalous
Baltimore and Ohio was
IRGC
never a
submarine
flat
communications.
railroad. Like much of the
The
eastern
Americans
coal
had not
country,
been
the
caught
line
off guard.
crossed ridges,
They had been
river
waiting.
valleys, and long
The
sustained grades where
EA-18G
train handling
Growlers,
mattered
call signs
enormously.
Havoc 1-1
Old
and Havoc
photographs from the
1-2,
area usually
left
show
the
smoking
Kennedy's
stacks,
waste catapults
curving
at
track cut into
02:23
hillsides, and freight
hours
trains
at
moving
full
through heavily
military
confined
power,
Appalachian
climbing through
geography.
400 knots in the first 20 seconds. Their
EM-1 was the answer the
ALQ-218
railroad
tactical
reached
jamming
for when it
receivers
needed the
were
most
already
muscle it
sweeping
could
the
legally put on those
electromagnetic
grades.
spectrum across the bog-hammer
And there is a
formation.
story behind
What the
why these
Growlers
locomotives
found
existed at
was
all.
extraordinary. The
truth
fastboat
is
swarm was
that the
not using
B&O did
standard
not really want
IRGC tactical
By the
radio
early
frequencies.
1940s, the
They were
railroad had already
operating on a
seen what diesel
distributed
power could
frequency
do,
hopping network
and
running
management
across
wanted more of
14
it. But
discrete
the Second
bands,
World War changed
changing
everything.
codes every
Diesel
400
production was tightly
milliseconds.
controlled, and the
A
War
system
Production
U.S.
Board
signals
restricted what the
intelligence had
railroad
never
could buy.
before seen deployed by the IRGC in an active engagement. Havoc 1-1's electronic
The B&O
warfare
was given a
officer
simple choice.
immediately
It
tagged
could
the
have
signature
30 modern
and transmitted
steam
it back to the
locomotives from
Kennedy's
Baldwin right on the main line,
SSEE
or it
Increment
could have
F
nothing at all.
signals
So the
exploitation
railroad
system.
ordered 32
The assessment came back in under 60
Yellowstones,
seconds.
class EM1.
The communications architecture
20 were
matched a
delivered in
system assessed to have been
1944,
transferred
and
to
the final
Iran
10
by a
arrived in
third-party state
1945.
actor within the last 90 days.
They
This
carried
was
road
not
numbers
improvised.
7,600
This was
through
state-sponsored.
7,629.
And whatever nation had handed Tehran this
And years
technology
later, in
had just made
1956,
themselves a
they were
party to the
renumbered
mining of the
650
world's
through
most critical waterway.
679. They
At
were the last new
02:26
steam power
hours,
Baltimore
the
and
Boghammer
Ohio
swarm
ever
made its
bought.
first coordinated
and although
move.
the railroad accepted
Not an
them
attack,
reluctantly,
a maneuver.
the EM1s
All
very quickly
47
proved
boats
themselves to be among the
simultaneously
finest
turned 15
articulated
degrees to
locomotives in the
starboard
entire
and began a
eastern United
slow,
States.
deliberate encirclement of the Paul Ignatius at a range of
When
4,000
B&O
yards.
President Roy White
They were not
inspected the
closing,
very first one
they were
delivered,
herding,
he is said
buying
to have turned to
time.
his superintendent of motive
Every minute
power
the
and
Paul
remarked
Ignatius
simply,
spent managing the
"Well,
surface
I
threat
must say they
was
have
another minute the
everything."
kilo below
indeed
had
they
to complete
did.
its mine belt.
The EM1
By
rode
nav
on
sense
roller
assessment,
bearings on every
the
axle,
Iris
even
Fateh
the
carried a
axles of the
payload
tender,
capacity of
which was
24
unusual for a freight
mines
engine of
in
the
its
period.
external keel
They
mine
were
belt.
modern, well-balanced,
At a deployment
and reliable,
speed of
and they looked the
2.1
part, with a
knots,
centered
with
headlight
one
and a
mine
clean,
dropped every
almost
90
handsome
seconds,
profile
the submarine
that many
had
rail fans
potentially been
considered the most
operational for
attractive of all
7
the
minutes
Yellowstones ever built.
before Triton 6-1's detection. That meant as many
The
as
numbers
4 to
themselves tell the
6
story of just how large
MDM-6
these
mines
machines
were already
The
resting on the
EM1 produced about
seafloor of the main
115,000
shipping
pounds
channel.
of tractive effort,
6
riding on
pressure-sensitive,
64-inch drivers,
magnetically
with
triggered
235
contact
pounds
mines.
of boiler pressure feeding
6
4
silent
cylinders.
reasons
Boiler
the Strait of
horsepower came in
Hormuz
around
could remain
5,900.
closed,
The
not for
locomotive
weeks,
alone weighed roughly
but for months,
627,000
possibly
pounds,
years.
and the tender added another 328,000
Commander Vargas made the call.
for a
She
combined
ordered
weight
the
of
Paul
more than 1
Ignatius to
million
reverse
pounds.
course
The
at
tender
20
carried
knots,
22,000
breaking the herding
gallons of water
maneuver,
and 25
and simultaneously
tons of coal.
authorized the
Nothing
launch
larger
of an
could have worked within the tunnel
MK-54
clearances
lightweight
and track
torpedo
restrictions of
from
the
her
B&O
port side
mainline.
triple tubes.
And that detail is worth pausing
Not a
on.
firing solution against the kilo, a warning shot. The
Among all the
MK-54 ran
884
hot,
Yellowstones
straight,
built
and
in
normal
America.
for 800
For the
yards,
Northern Pacific, the
then went
Southern Pacific,
active with
the
its
Duluth,
sonar
Mesab,
pinger,
and Iron Range, and the
broadcasting a
B&O.
deafening, active pulse
The
directly
Baltimore
at
and
the
Ohio's
kilo's hull
EM1s were
at
actually the
close
smallest
range.
of the type. Yet
The message
B&O
to the
owned
Iranian
most of them,
submarine
30 in
commander
all,
was
and they were the most
unmistakable.
modern. The
We know
railroad's
you are
tight
there.
eastern clearances
We
simply
know
would
what
not
you
allow
are
anything
doing.
bigger. So
Stop.
the EM1 represented
The
a careful
kilo stopped
balance.
moving.
The largest power the road
At
could physically
02:29
operate,
hours,
and no larger.
contact Romeo went dead quiet. The Iris Fateh had
In their
shut down
early
her
years,
propulsion,
the
her
EM1s were
systems,
assigned to the
her
Cumberland Division,
noise.
one of the most
The
physically demanding
Kilo-class
stretches on the
submarine,
entire
designed
system.
in the Soviet
The main
era
district
and
they
upgraded
served
with
ran from
Iranian
Cumberland, Maryland,
IRGC
west toward
modifications,
Grafton, West
was
Virginia.
reverting to her primary
A
survival
region of
strategy.
heavy coal traffic, fast
Absolute
freight, and unrelenting
silence.
grades.
She
This
was going to
hard
drift
railroading.
and
Heavy
wait.
trains climbed slowly
The
through
Iranian
the
commander,
mountains, and locomotive
Captain Second
assignments
Rank
depended
Davoud
heavily on
Kashani,
tonnage and
believed
terrain,
he had
just as they
one
had in
card
earlier
left to
decades.
play. The fast boats above would keep the Americans occupied long enough for the mines already deployed to do their work once global shipping resumed. He didn't need to escape. He just needed to survive until dawn. He had underestimated the
EM1s were
USS
versatile
Vermont.
in a way that
At
surprised even the
02:31
B&O,
hours,
although they were
40
designed
nautical
first and
miles
last for
south,
heavy freight. In
Vermont
their
went
early
to
years,
400
they were
feet
occasionally pressed
and pushed her
into passenger service when the railroad
GES-9G
needed
reactor
power.
plant to 90% power.
A 1,000,000-pound articulated
She was making
freight
better
engine
than
on the
30
head end of a
knots,
passenger train
a speed
was an
that no
unusual sight,
surface ship
but it
radar
speaks
can
to how
detect,
capable and
and no
well-mannered these
conventional
locomotives
towed
turned out
array
to be.
sonar can
The road that
reliably
never
track
wanted them
in the
found itself
acoustic
using
clutter
them
of
for
a
almost
war
everything.
zone. Her BSY-2 combat system had already developed a preliminary firing solution for contact Romeo, based solely on the data relayed from Triton 6-1. Vermont was not approaching as a warning. She was approaching as an executioner, holding a loaded trigger and waiting for the order that nobody wanted to give.
Here the engine was always working.
At the same time, NavCent activated the one asset that nobody had briefed to the public. Embedded in the belly of a Navy P-8A Poseidon circling at 28,000 feet overhead was an AN/AES-1 airborne mine detection system, transmitting multispectral laser pulses into the shallow water column directly along the shipping lane centerline. Within 6 minutes of activation, the Poseidon sensors had confirmed 5 discrete bottom contact anomalies, each one measuring between 1.2 and 1.4 meters in length, perfectly round, perfectly spaced at 400-meter intervals along the main channel.
The EM-1s were gradually
5
displaced from the mountain divisions where they had spent
mines
their first years.
on the seafloor
did
of
not
the
simply
world's most
disappear,
critical oil shipping
Instead,
lane.
the railroad shifted
A
them to
minefield
Newark,
that,
where
if
their
left
raw
in
pulling
place,
power could still
would
earn their
close
keep
the
a
Strait of
little longer.
Hormuz to
The
commercial
class was
shipping for
reassigned to
6
the Pittsburgh
months,
division, where the
regardless
EM-1s
of any
handled Lake Mineral
ceasefire,
traffic and
regardless
trains
of
running
any
between Wheeling and
diplomatic
Pittsburgh.
agreement, regardless of any deal negotiated in Washington or Islamabad or Geneva. The mines do not care about politics. They care about the magnetic signature of a fully laden supertanker passing 4 meters above them.
At 0237 hours, NavCent transmitted the most critical message of the night. Not to the Paul Ignatius, not to Vermont, not to the Growlers, but to a 12-man Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal Mobile Unit team aboard 2 rigid inflatable boats holding station in the shadow of a rocky shoal 3 nautical miles west of the detection zone. Nav Ode Mob Unit 5, codenamed Sandbar Alpha, had been pre-positioned for exactly this contingency 48 hours earlier. The mission directive was 3 words: execute, recover, sanitize. What followed was 14 minutes of the most dangerous maritime EOD operation of the conflict. 2 RIBE teams running blacked out at 35 knots, navigating by GPS-referenced mine position data transmitted directly from the P-8A overhead. Each team responsible for deploying Mk-30 influence sweep gear and Mk-7 neutralizing charges. The Boghammer swarm was still holding its encirclement of the Paul Ignatius, now 6 nautical miles distant, with 0 visibility on the EOD teams operating in the shadow of the shallow ridge. The Iranian fastboat commanders did not know the trap had been reversed. They believed they were still dictating the tempo. On the surface, it looked like a standoff. Below the surface, the Americans were systematically dismantling Iran's most dangerous strategic card, 1 mine at a time. At 0241 hours, Sandbar Alpha's lead diver, Senior Chief Petty Officer James Okafor, entered the water at a point 18 inches above a live MDM-6 mine and began the neutralization sequence using a lightweight neutralizer charge with a 4-minute time delay fuse. The mine was a Soviet-designed device, but with visible Iranian machining modifications, new triggering electronics, a secondary magnetic influence sensor, and an anti-handling circuit that, if the mine had been disturbed even slightly before the neutralizer was fully seated, would have detonated it immediately. Senior Chief Okafor had trained for this exact mine variant in a classified simulation at Explosive Ordnance Disposal School Eglin 9 months earlier. He moved with the calm precision of a surgeon performing open heart surgery in a blackout. The water temperature was 28 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 0. He was working entirely by touch and by the red filtered beam of a dive light held in his teeth. At 0244 hours, the first neutralizer detonated, a muffled, concussive thump that sent a column of white water 20 feet into the dark Hormuz night. Then the second at 90 seconds. Then the third, the fourth, and the fifth. 5 mines.
The
5
Yellowstones were the
neutralizations,
giants, but they worked within a
5
whole
fewer
living system
reasons
of
the
yards,
global
branches,
economy
and
would
town
collapse when the
trackage that
sun
was all
rose
running
over the
on borrowed
Persian
time.
Gulf.
The footage itself
Simultaneously,
is precious precisely because of
800
when it was
meters to the
shot.
south, the Havoc 11 Growler executed
Bruce
a
Ward
precision
filmed in 16mm color during
ALQ-99
the late
jamming run
1950s and
across
into the
all
early
14 frequency
1960s,
bands of
in
the
the last
Boghammer
seasons when
network
steam still ruled the
simultaneously,
main line.
flooding the
The B&O scenes
IRGC
date
fast
largely
boat
from
command net
1957.
with impenetrable
Within just a few
electronic
years,
noise.
almost everything
In the
in
span
that
of 8
footage would be
seconds,
gone.
47
The engines
Iranian
scrapped,
fast
the
attack boats went
operations
tactically
dieselized,
deaf
the
and
era
blind.
closed.
Their encrypted radio nets
The film is
dissolved into
essentially a
static.
record of the
Their
very
targeting
end of
data
something,
links
because by the
flatlined.
late 1950s,
The carefully
the writing was
orchestrated
clearly
swarm
on the
became
wall.
47 individual boats with no coordination,
In
no
1958,
communications,
the B&O
and
made
no
the decision
orders.
to cease all major
At
expenditures on
02:51